So in this video, we're going to go through the four, or what I like to call the four forces of evolution. So the first one is going to be gene flow. The second one is genetic drift, which can be broken into founder effects and bottlenecks. And the third then is selection, which has two different types, artificial and natural. Now that I think about it, that's really only three. So we'll just change that to three forces of evolution. So the first, gene flow, is effectively just a fancy way to say migration. So if we were to have two particular populations, and I'll see if I can draw this correctly. Let's try that again. No, that's not going to work. There we go. And so if we call these, we'll call them islands, right? And we'll say one of them is going to be called Blue Land, the other one is going to be called Orange World. And so in Blue Land, we have 100% of people are going to be blue. We're just going to represent them with dots. And so really, technically what we're looking for is a change in allele frequencies, which is actually coming down to counting each of the alleles in the genotypes. But for the simplicity of the video, what we'll do is we'll just be counting people based on their phenotype, but keep in mind, technically you want to be looking at allele frequencies, not necessarily phenotypic frequencies. Again, for simplicity, we might just say that all of the blue individuals are homozygous for that particular allele or trait, and all of the orange members in Orange World are all going to be homozygous as well, and we'll just ignore the reality of carriers or heterozygotes altogether. So in Blue Land, what that would mean is that we have 100% blue and 0% orange. And then that would also mean that in Orange World, we have 0% blue and 100% orange. And so what could happen then is we might then have migration of individuals, say from Blue Land, migrating across to Orange World. And so when they do that, they may then enter that population and then begin to interbreed with the population of Orange World. And so what we would expect is that then the genetics or the alleles of the blue individuals might start intermingling with the Orange World population, and over a number of breeding generations, we'll start to see the sudden appearance of blue individuals in the population, and therefore the allele frequencies will start to shift. We'll see that the 100% orange will now start to decrease, let's say to 50%, and the blue individuals, which used to be representing 0% of that population, now making up the other 50%. And so because of this, we have a change in allele frequencies, which would be the definition of evolution as having occurred. So then the second force is going to be genetic drift. Now this is one that a lot of people get confused. It's not the same as gene flow. Gene flow is migration. Genetic drift is about we could say the drifting of genetics or genes across generations, leading to a change in allele frequencies. And there are two key types of genetic drift that can occur. So the first one is founder effects. And so what we'll do here is I'll just copy down that picture to save myself the effort, because we all know how difficult that was for me to draw the circles. If we remove all of those individuals, this time we're going to assume that what was Orange World is now going to be an empty piece of land. And so we're going to have founders from Blue Land in this case that are going to be colonizing, or we'll say like entering into and populating this otherwise empty landmass. So the key thing is that the proportions in the founding group is going to determine the proportions of a particular allele in the new colony or in the new population. And so if we take, for example, the example of the Amish community originally from kind of Germany, and they then settled and founded land or not really founded, I should say, but we can kind of say founded in that they didn't interbreed or intermingle in any other way with any existing populations. A small group made their way from Europe and then settled in Pennsylvania in America. And it just so happened that of the individuals that were on the boat to make their way across and make the voyage, a larger proportion of them actually had something called polydactyly, which is a genetic defect. It's actually linked to a form of dwarfism that means that you end up with 6 fingers and toes, that kind of thing. And so even though polydactyly wasn't very common, in fact, it was as common in the Amish population, because it was slightly higher in the small founding group that made their way across, when they then populated the American landmass in Pennsylvania and began their own very kind of secluded colony, we'll say, then we saw a much, much higher incidence of polydactyly. And so in this case, if we say that polydactyly represented 10% in the old land, but then 100% of the founders had polydactyly, well, then we would see 100% of polydactyly in the new population that is formed. So the difference is it's not quite migration, because it's movement of a gene pool to a new unfounded map of land. In the example I've given, it's obviously not actually unfounded. There would have already been populations that existed there, but for simplicity, we'll assume that there were none. And this is to mirror the fact that the Amish community, although they populated an existing populated land, they were not interbreeding with the existing population. So it kind of acts more as founder effects rather than gene flow. And so then the next type of genetic drift is bottleneck events. And so what occurs here is we have a chance event that basically wipes out a large portion of a population, and this makes small populations very, very susceptible to it as opposed to large populations. And so let's say, for example, there was a volcano eruption in Blue Land, and it so happens that it wipes out a good chunk of the population. And so we'll change it up a little bit this time. We'll have a number of green individuals in Blue Land, but they represented the minority. And so let's say here we can see they maybe make up around about 20% of the population, the green individuals. But let's say by chance that the volcanic activity actually wiped out almost all of the blue individuals. It could be by chance, there could have been some other factor that was contributing. Maybe the blue individuals were living closer to the volcano itself, but for whatever reason, we now see that the surviving group is actually largely green individuals, in this case 75%, and only 25% blue now. And so that surviving group are going to determine the carried gene pool and therefore allele frequencies in the existing population as they try to then repopulate that. And so we can see now, because of that bottlenecking, that the phrase kind of comes from the idea of an event constricting the population in the same way that a bottleneck constricts the flow of, say, water out of the bottle, and only a very limited amount get through, i.e. survive. And so what that then means is we now have a completely different, completely altered allele frequency in the new group. We have an increase in the green allele frequency. And so instead of blue land, maybe we could change it to greenland. And then the third and final type is selection. So again, selection has two different types of process, we'll say. And so one of them is natural selection. And so this is really kind of the crux of the Darwinian evolutionary theory, and that is that advantageous traits will be selected for by nature, and disadvantageous traits will be selected against. And these are the words that you want to use. So it makes it sound like nature has a mind of its own. It's really just like cause and effect. So if something is advantageous, it's going to lead to greater survival rates. If something is disadvantageous, it's going to decrease survival rates. So we're going to see the survival of the fittest is kind of the phrase that gets thrown around. And so we can look at, for example, giraffes were thought to have actually had a much, much shorter neck, and they looked kind of weird like this. But then through completely random mutation and chance events, we started to see some individuals had slightly longer necks than others. And I guess you could even see this in humans. Some have longer necks, some have shorter necks. But our neck length is not really changing our survival rates in any way. Whereas in giraffes, what this was actually doing was it was allowing those with the longer necks to reach a greater food source that was higher up and wasn't in as direct competition with other organisms. And so what that meant is that the short-necked giraffes might actually have been missing out on food source. And so they may have been dying of starvation. And you can see here that this would unintentionally, without any conscious effort from the giraffe, or definitely from nature or anything, would be decreasing the likelihood of survival for the short-necked giraffes. And those with the longer necks, still of the same species, they're now able to access a greater variety of food, or at least a greater volume of food. And so therefore they would be considered as being selected for their advantageous trait. Along the way, there would have been lots of other ones in this process. This is a very long process, so it doesn't happen overnight. It would have been little millimeter changes at a time, and generation by generation, we slowly see that the fitter individuals are the ones that have the longer necks, and we end up with the giraffe that we have now. And so then the second type of selection is artificial selection. And so this is where humans really get involved in the process and artificially control the direction of evolution. And so we can see that, for example, in the dairy industry, dairy farmers will select and specifically selectively breed cows that have a higher milk production rate. And so this is often due to genetic factors. So the cows that have the genetic variants that lead to greater milk production are going to be more valuable to the farmer. And so therefore they will choose to breed those particular cows and not breed the cows that are not producing as much milk. And so often those cows that aren't producing as much milk will then be sold or moved to the cattle industry, probably used for beef in that case. And so we can see here that humans are interfering with the natural selection process and choosing to select sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes for specific purpose, but not necessarily for the survival of the individual. So we can see that artificial selection of milk-producing cows is not necessarily increasing the likelihood of its survival. It's not selecting for it in any particular way. It is changing the way the allele frequencies alter or evolve over time. Although I guess if you did want to go right into the side of animal ethics, then technically artificial selection for the individuals that are producing more milk is aiding their survival, because otherwise they'll probably go to the cattle industry. And so there we go. So these are the three forces of evolution that will determine how allele frequencies will change over time, and they can explain why evolution occurs. So the first is gene flow, migration. The second is genetic drift, the change in allele frequencies generation to generation due to either founder effects or bottleneck events. And selection, whether that is naturally occurring or if it's artificially being selected by humans.